So this is one of two fireside chats we have tonight. The other two will be more like little TED Talks. Thanks, man.
What's up? Happy to be here. And I made sure to wear the same jacket in the picture, so make it simple.
Well, kind of on a personal note, like so Brandon has been with Bitcoin since 2017, and there's been so much discussed in these in that world, right, about what Bitcoin will be. Like, it's a balance between like containing the excitement, right, without getting too, over the top about how big Bitcoin can be. And so I just want to ask you right now. So again, he's been discussing this stuff for years about how big it can get, emphasizing Bitcoin as the focal point of this whole industry. And I just want to ask, how does it feel to be vindicated? The past few weeks, seeing what Bitcoin solely, not Ethereum, maybe a little, but basically all Bitcoin has been in the headlines. Maybe Solana, meme coins, of course, all that. But really, when it comes to the big wheels that are turning in the country right now, legislatively, politically, all that, financially, Bitcoin. So, like, what's it been for you the last few weeks?
I'm gonna be honest, it feels absolutely great. But it's not just the money. The money is cool. That's just, the scorecard of how right you were. It feels good to be right about seeing a future that I believe is very optimistic at an individual level, at a country level, whatever level you want to look at. This thing scales all the way up. And just being considered crazy for so long and now still being, sort of crazy, but soon to be entirely obvious, right? In 5 or 10 years, we'll look back and say, how did I miss this thing? It's so obvious. And so, yeah, it feels good.
Why don't you catch us up on, from your perspective, working for a Bitcoin company, he runs the Minneapolis Bitcoiners, or Bitcoiners in Minneapolis. They just had a casual meetup with about as many people as we had here last Tuesday, by the way. By the way, we're just going to meet up on a Tuesday night. Room fills right up, all-time highs will do that, I guess, but where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so he runs that. So like, give us kind of the rundown of the past few weeks. So we know about obviously the price, but what does this mean? Like, is this Bitcoin really turning a corner, a new chapter, in its growth? Like, just kind of summarize where we're at right now, just from the last few weeks.
Yeah, I think it's clear that this is a massive turning point in Bitcoin. I think there's a before 2024 and an after 2024. Quick history. In the early days, Bitcoin was a weird internet curiosity. Only the cypherpunks and some weird libertarians online found this thing. Government largely ignored it. Call it around 2017. Price started to go up, a little more attention. The government still ignored it or just sort of talked down on it, hoping it would go away. Then I would say in around 2020, late 2023, some legislation passed, which led to the ETFs being approved and launching early 2024. There's a bunch of those now. They're the most successful ETFs in history. They're slurping up billions of dollars for Bitcoin. You can put MicroStrategy in that pile as well, which is a publicly traded software company that more or less is becoming a Bitcoin acquisition vehicle. Very interesting story there. I'd recommend looking into that. That was the topic of the meetup last month. So that's there. Then we had some increasing momentum this summer. We were in Nashville. I saw Raphael there, where he is now, and probably more people in the room at the Bitcoin conference. Honestly, it turned into a political conference about Bitcoin, which wasn't great, but they had their moment and shine. And we saw people like Cynthia Lummis and RFK and Trump and Ro Khanna and many others very, very supportive of Bitcoin here, which is a monumental achievement. Out of that came Cynthia Lummis's proposal for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I'll mention this many times tonight, which is essentially, hey, the government should acquire some Bitcoin. She proposed 1 million coins, roughly 5% of the supply, over the next, call it 3 to 5 years. And that alone is just totally crazy looking backwards. Like, how is that even a conversation? And I do think that the incoming administration is very supportive of this. Okay, let's look at the election. This was a red wave, no other way to look at it. The people spoke loud and clear. They want to change. And part of that change involves Bitcoin. All the cabinet members, Trump himself, they're all very supportive of this thing. So I do think a strategic Bitcoin reserve is in the cards for 2025. Won't be able to be done executive orders, so we'll have to go through Congress, but I think it has a good shot. And if we do go down that way, I think it's going to create a knock-on effect around the entire world. If the US government says yes and we start buying, you're going to see all Western aligned countries make a buy next year. Our competitors will do the same if they want to keep up. And so I think the knock-on effects alone, even if we barely buy any Bitcoin or even if we don't buy Bitcoin, it's been normalized, it's been de-risked, and I think that will carry the momentum. And I think it's on all of us to seize the opportunity here. I'm very, very optimistic about it. Yet to be seen, but we have the future in front of us if we so choose.
Almost like I need to applause for that right there. Are you seeing that? Are we seeing some of that scramble, or do you suspect that that's happening behind the scenes, where other Western countries, or I don't know, small non-Western countries are saying, hey, why don't we get all, let's front run this thing. We're quicker, we're more nimble. We can do this without. I'm the king. I can just do whatever. In some countries, whatever. Let's just do this. Saudi Arabia, let's just do this. I mean, companies, or pension funds, I've heard, are is it Michigan? I can't remember. One state's pension funds like, let's get some Bitcoin. So, like, do you see this as just the early stages of what's going to be a kind of a scramble?
Yeah, I do. I would say we haven't seen any enormous announcements on the heels of the US's strategic Bitcoin reserve, but this has been a trend for early adopters for years. El Salvador is a good example, tiny country. They have $700 million for the Bitcoin. You look at Bhutan. I bet most people in the room cannot point out Bhutan on a map. A small Himalayan country, they have over $1 billion from the Bitcoin, and they just monetize their remote hydro assets. So they're converting natural resources that are not being used into the next future reserve currency of the world. And so you start to see the early adopters coming in, the small countries with nothing to lose. And I think if we look forward, it's going to be dominoes for the next 5 or 10 years. And again, it will be obvious. So I think the problem here, separating the short-term news on the SPR, the real problem here is that humans, strategic Bitcoin reserve, sorry. I don't want to say strategic Bitcoin reserve 100 times, so SPR, we're good on that. Where was I going with that? Sorry. So we have a capital preservation problem. Okay, as individuals, prices are going up, wages are not keeping up. It is hard for the average person to get ahead. Guess what? Corporations have the same problem. Many of the Russell 2000 are zombie companies waiting to die. The banks have toxic debt all over their balance sheets. They're in rough shape too. Countries are no different. The US just passed $36 trillion in debt. Well, guess what? Our kids and our grandkids have a problem there if it doesn't happen sooner. So if you look around, what's the solution? You could buy bonds. Over the last 5 years, they've returned negative 5%. You can own equities, right around 7% per annum. That's the monetary inflation rate, by the way, so you're keeping pace. If you own the Mag 7, the 7 best companies in the world, you're at about 10% per annum. So you're barely keeping up with monetary inflation. Okay, then you look at gold, 5%, again, losing capital. Then we have Bitcoin. Over the last 5 years, it's over 50% compounded annual growth rate. So there's the solution to our capital destruction or capital preservation problem. Okay, that's going to scale all around the world. And it's global, it's a fixed supply asset, and there's infinite fiat being printed for various different reasons. So I think that is where we're going to go, and I think that's more or less the impetus that's going to drive this wave. I think the US SPR is just gas on the fire. It was going to happen anyways. Just pull the future forward a few years.
If everyone runs to get it, those who are late are going to miss out. Is that how this game works?
So I think the common question, I think there's 2 parts to Bitcoin. There's the monetization phase. That's where we are now. And then there's the at equilibrium phase. Okay, the monetization phase is everyone in the world looking around and realizing they have a capital preservation problem and finding Bitcoin. Some people found it very early, some people very late. The earlier you are, the more risk there is. So people took enormous risks socially and economically in order to see those gains. The later you are, the less risk, the less upside. That's life. That's how it is. That's how it's always been. It's not a bad thing. So yeah, people take risks, they get rewarded. Then at equilibrium phase, whatever this Bitcoin asset becomes, whatever its equilibrium market price is, I think north of 100 trillion is the right way to think about this. In that world, what happens? Okay, Bitcoin will probably gain purchasing power at the rate of economic growth. Something like global GDP, couple 2-3%, if we're lucky, that would be the growth rate of Bitcoin's purchasing power. Okay, what else does it do? It creates a fair monetary system. All 8 billion people can opt in and choose to use a monetary network, similar to the internet protocols we have today. It can be accessed by anyone and it's owned by no one. So there's tremendous value for the entire world. Even if you don't see price appreciation, having a monetary asset at the bedrock of our global society that anyone can use has untold benefit for the world. One example, if you live in a developing country, remember when I talked about the Mag 7 and the S&P 500? Most people can't access those assets. So they have far worse assets to invest in, okay? Bitcoin opens capital markets to anyone. If you don't want to go down with the ship because your central bank blows up your currency, many such cases, you can go on your phone and buy some Bitcoin and decide, I would like to take life into my own hands. That has untold benefits for the world. If just 0.1% more people can preserve their wealth, which means they can come up with a business, bring an idea to market, etc. If one Elon Musk, if one Nikola Tesla, if one Maya Angelou is buried in Zimbabwe's bureaucracy and they can access capital markets, bring their idea to life, guess what? We all benefit from their innovations. And Bitcoin is one part of that puzzle that unlocks that human capital.
Yeah, that kind of vision of Bitcoin as the world currency was sort of what I was talking about in my talk about how it's so tempting to go to, and that this isn't a dig at all. It's so tempting to go to that place where, yeah, without countries fighting over their fiat currencies, that'd be less reason to go to war, right? Because currency hegemony, monetary hegemony. But getting there, right? That blend on the way, right? There's so much that's going to happen between now and then. One thought that came to mind when you were describing companies and governments, whatever institutions it might be, getting a hold of Bitcoin because it's going up so fast. Hey, we can ride this elevator up, and it can save our institution, whether it be a country or a company. So, kind of two thoughts strike me there. One is the companies that don't grab on, or the institutions that don't grab on, they're going to be left with a bunch of debt that they can't. There's not a comparable appreciating asset to help them up out of the debt that they're going to drown. And then two, what about like a badly run? It reminds me of Yahoo. They invested in Alibaba, I think, early. And so Yahoo has a ton of money because they invested in Alibaba, but Yahoo's Yahoo. So it's kind of funny, right? Like they're doing great financially, but not many people use Yahoo anymore. So I kind of wonder about that contrast or that clash of an institution or whatever, it might be a company or a government, whatever, that's not doing, but they have a bunch of Bitcoin, so they're super rich or they're doing well fiscally. I don't know. Do you kind of see that contrast or clash happening, playing out in some weird ways?
Yeah, definitely. I think you can look up through historical examples ad nauseum where innovators come up with a new technology, and if you do not adopt the new technology, you fall behind. Okay, if you hide in your castle all day long and some guy invents gunpowder and he starts blowing down your walls and you don't want to adopt gunpowder because it's scary or risky or it's too volatile or it's weird, your castle gets blown up and you go obsolete. If you're on a horse and someone comes up with a gun, well, your armor and your horse or the crossbow, actually in that case, is very effective. And so I think the same is true today. If you are stuck in the 20th century capital, which would be the Treasury Reserve, fiat money, U.S. government debt, whatever you want to call that, or backed by gold, that is capital in the 20th century. If you're stuck there, rather than entering the 21st century of capital, which is Bitcoin, you will marginally be outcompeted, and that's how it goes.
Do you see the, kind of put it in two stages? I forget what you called the first stage, but the second stage is when Bitcoin is money. It's at an equilibrium and then that run up. Is that the difference between Bitcoin being digital gold on the run up and then Bitcoin being money at the top?
I think the definitions make it actually harder to figure out what this thing is. I think digital gold is a useful analogy. Bitcoin is a synthetic commodity money, if you want to be technical in its type. And gold is also a commodity money, so it's pretty similar. And so I think digital gold is useful, but digital gold undersells what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is also software. You can add layers of protocols on top. You can attach things to the side. It learns, it upgrades itself. And so I think the first phase is monetization. We're figuring out that we have a new monetary asset, and we're trying to figure out what it's going to be good for and how big the market will support that. I think digital gold or store value function is probably the first thing. Makes the most sense. Look around, Visa's great, swiping cards is great, Apple Pay is great. Everyone in the room, we don't need to use Bitcoin to buy our coffee. However, that's not true all over the world. Between 1 and 2 million people have no banking infrastructure or they're underbanked. That's a lot of people who don't have access to the absolute basics of financial services. And we talk about volatility. Well, if you have a currency that's inflating by 30% a month, 10% a month, 20% a month, Bitcoin's volatility actually looks pretty good in comparison. And so just a reminder to think global on that one. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And I'm not sure what answers there really could be for these sorts of big crystal ball kinds of questions, right? Where one other term you mentioned to me when we were shooting emails back and forth about this was multipolar world. So I touched on that too in my talk about the idea of, oh, we're going to have a bunch of little startups. And, you know, the idea of the nation state might eventually make way for something new. That might be a different topic or different trajectory. But what do you see with the United States as you know, the sole superpower? Do you see Bitcoin playing a part in kind of the world politics?
Yeah, I do. I think we're at a fracturing point globally. If you look around, we're starting to see the fraying of the petrodollar system. Okay, this is US government debt as the reserve asset that all countries around the world own. China, Russia included, our enemies, they buy our debt too. And that's been the safe asset. That's been the asset that all of our trade imbalances are used to fund our debt. That's where they save their money. Point being, that's the regime is starting to fracture. You see the rise of the BRICS currency, the BRICS nations. They're trying to make currency. I'm pretty bearish on that. But it's a sign of things starting to fray. You see China and Russia net sellers of our US treasuries. So you're starting to see the tide change. What's going to happen in the future? Way too complex to have any confidence. But what I do see is a race to accumulate the Bitcoin. I think the race is very clearly on. I think the US is in a strong position because we have a united government that seems to have an appetite for this thing. And I think we're going to see all other nation states compete for it. And after that global digital gold rush is complete, I think we will probably architect a new global financial system around this asset. I'll come back to that geopolitical vision. It starts to get pretty unclear to me, but I want to hammer the digital gold rush here first. Okay, remember Germany? Germany sold 50,000 Bitcoins this summer at like 50K or 60K or something for some silly reason. They said it's like too volatile or whatever. Well, that volatile asset, if they would have held it just till today, they would have another $1.5 billion. If they hold it for another 5 or 10 years, you do the math. I don't know. It's going to be high. Okay, we hold it as a country 200,000 Bitcoin. We seized them from some whatever, and the plan is to get another million. Okay, so we're going to race and we're going to own 5% of the supply. All things go well. And what is the thesis of the strategic Bitcoin reserve? In the shortest sense possible, it's to buy the future. Okay, we're looking to the future, and we're the global reserve currency today. We have all the power, and we are going to make a decision to buy a stake in the future. What does that do? If we're right about Bitcoin, well, we maintain our power for the next 100, 200, 500 years. If we're wrong, well, we spent some few billion dollars that we printed ourselves. Okay, this is a pretty good trade. This is about 1,000x asymmetric trade. This is a no-brainer trade. Okay, so I think that's what's going on here. Let's talk about buying the future. Let's look at some history. Okay, at one point, some fine Brits took a ship over to the New World, and they started a new country in America. Later, we bought New York from the Dutch for a small fee. Napoleon had a war to fight in Europe. He sold us a third of the country for the Louisiana Purchase. We bought Texas, we bought California, Nevada, Alaska from the Russians, the list goes on. Each one of those trades was a massive success for our country. Okay, so I think about the similar type of approach here with Bitcoin. And Michael Saylor has a good talk on that topic. I encourage you to listen to that. And there's no more there's no more land. Okay, we cannot go west. We have to go digital. We have to go into cyberspace. We have to go accumulate Bitcoin. So that's where we are now. And I think 2009 was the transition point from industrial capital, gold or fiat money, into digital capital, Bitcoin. I think 2024 accelerated it. In hindsight, it'll be extremely obvious, like I said. And so we do this gold rush. What does it do for America? Okay, capital preservation for our country. We have a debt problem. Remember 36 trillion? If we buy a bunch of Bitcoin in the next 5 years and hold it for 20, 30 years, our debt problem will not be a problem anymore. It also makes Bitcoin the global capital of the world. Let's bring all the countries here. Let's bring all the entrepreneurs here. Just like the internet in the 90s, our government was freaking out because, oh my gosh, you can't control it and bad people use it, whatever. Ultimately, cooler heads prevailed. And what happened? Largest companies, the mag set we just talked about, they're primarily internet companies, all built here, employing our people, tax revenue for our country. So I think we need to do the same thing for Bitcoin. And all that human capital, again, is going to spur so much innovation. So again, asymmetric bet, that's the SBR, that's the trade. It's very obvious, that's the race. Do you want to go into geopolitical potentials?
We might be limited on time. I want to see if anyone has any questions after I ask you one more. And that is, you talk about the U.S. Strengthening its position because it has a bunch of Bitcoin. That Bitcoin was seized from Ross Ulbricht, right, and Silk Road. And a lot of maybe the cypherpunks. Yeah, thank you. They're not happy about those tokens. They might refer to those as stolen, or and like ill-gotten gains. And like when I personally look at like the history, this is maybe getting a little too revealing here, but I look at like some of the atrocious things, right? Like the U.S. military has done things like that. I'm sometimes like, I don't want the U.S. to have more power, And I don't want to sound anti-patriotic. I love the U.S., but some of the atrocities are like, yeah, So how does that ideological desire to kind of take some of the air out of the balloon, these huge states, right, and their militaries and this and that. If U.S. has an asset that's going up and it strengthens the country, does that strengthen the U.S. military? Does that mean more countries that we invade because we're rich again or whatever? Like, how does that square with Bitcoiners, maybe yourself?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to take this one. First, the stuck on war. I think that one hits home the hardest, especially looking around right now. We should not be meddling abroad, by the way. We should absolutely stop that. Okay, wars over the last 50 years or so, honestly going back to World War I, but let's just keep it 50 years in advance. What did we do to go to war? Did we ask the citizens if they care? Did we raise war bonds? Did we do any of that? No. We created credit card wars. The US government printed whatever money they needed to send our sons and daughters abroad to go die in some war in a country we can't find on a map. Okay, they did that by convincing the public that it was a good idea, lying about Iraq, for example, the endless examples. Okay, so currently they're waging wars abroad and they're just printing the money, which we pay for, but we essentially have no consent here. They just manufacture consent. In a Bitcoin world, what happens? Well, fiat money is a source of power, one of the biggest sources of power in the world for our government, for other governments. If they cannot just print money out of thin air to go to war, then they're going to have to ask us if we consent to going to war. And there's good reasons to defend our border. There's good reasons to have war abroad. And if those reasons are actually good, the people will support it. Okay, so essentially the takeaway here is that Bitcoin removes the printing press from the government, and it gives the money back to the people. And what that acts as is a restraining order to unchecked power. And that's the key. It just brings symmetry between people and their governments, rather than a government that can just go wild. So I think that's the key there. Another point is around ideological clashing between Bitcoiners and the state. It's true. In the early days, it's mostly cypherpunks, which are like cyber libertarians, kind of like they saw the future and they want us to be able to communicate without our government spying on us, without them censoring our money, etc. And then the early libertarians as well kind of rose up in that energy. It's diffused now quite a bit, but that's the early days. And they would say, why would we want the banks to have the money? The banks are bad, the governments are bad, etc. The reality is, number one, if we're right about Bitcoin, it is the best financial asset on the planet, which I do believe. If we're right about that, of course the governments are going to buy it. That means that we're winning. Okay, the real question is, what happens when they buy it? Do the properties that we care about persist? Does it still maintain its neutrality? Or can some government somewhere change the rules and start to co-opt this thing? That's the key. I believe that Bitcoin was architected fundamentally in a way that would resist capture, but we don't know yet. So I think that's the next phase to look at. I think that's the interesting side of the ideology.
Cool. Love to have you on the podcast. Yeah. Any questions for Brandon? All right, we got a couple hands. Where's the microphones? Okay.
What are Bitcoin developers working on now that will benefit governments and nations? We only talked about like the capital, the wealth, the monetary thing. Does the government benefit from layer twos or runes? I don't know. What else can Bitcoin developers do to make this an asset to nations?
Yeah, I think the nation states are pretty far behind on figuring out what this Bitcoin thing is. I think they're pretty content thinking about it as a part of their treasury. And so I think that's about as far as they're going with it. Hold it, buy more, never sell it. That's what they're doing. That's what we should all be doing as well. If we look outside of government, to give you a little meat to that question, I think the developers are looking at scalability and they're looking at privacy. And they're looking at ways to unencumber Bitcoin, the asset, from Bitcoin's blockchain. Okay, blockchains are purposely designed to be inefficient, and that inefficiency cost by decentralization, right? You could just have a single computer that keeps track of the ledger, but Bitcoin says we're going to put a database on all the computers all around the world, and there's a very high cost to maintain that level of decentralization. Okay, so it's inefficient by design, but what that gains us is the inability for the rules to be changed or the ledger to be co-opted. Okay, so essentially unencumber Bitcoin, the asset, from the blockchain, which could be a layer two, it could be a side chain, it could be any type of software you can imagine, each with different trade-offs. Is it as secure as Bitcoin on those layers? No. Is there market demand for it? Yes, you mentioned Ruin. So there's gonna be a whole bunch of stuff there. I think the next thing is improving its custody. So there's different transaction types that would allow us to store Bitcoin in a different way. Maybe you could say, hey, if I lost my key, my private key for my coins, and I don't check in 1 year, change the rules for my Bitcoin so that my friend can unlock it for me. Right? I just made up an example, but different social technologies so that we can store it better. That's another way to think about it.
One more question?
What do you think of Lightning in general, and then just the layer twos that are going on? Do you have any opinion on those?
I do. In 2018, I gave a presentation in Bali, pitching the Lightning Network as the second coming and just save the world. In the crowd, I was fighting against some Bcashers. If you know that history, you'll understand what that means at the time. I would say I was overly optimistic then. I would say sentiment now is overly pessimistic. I think the truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. And I think what Lightning Network is a business to business or an infrastructure layer that allows typically entities to communicate through Bitcoin together. It is not a individual user system. It's more like what Cash App and Square and Robinhood and your bank will use to move Bitcoin around. And so if we properly understand this thing, it means infinite scalability, zero transaction costs, instant confirmation for the globe. You just have to run through intermediaries because the UX hurdles to use it raw right on L2, right on the Lightning Network are pretty high. And so unless we figure out some new ways to use this thing, think of it as just like infrastructure connecting different software. It also pairs well with other things like Fedi. Federated Chaumian eCash, which we don't have time for, but look that up if you're interested.
Okay, yeah, one minute. Yep.
Oh, it's not a tiny question. It's actually two questions, and I'll let you answer however much or as little as you want. But when you're talking about like Bitcoin being used worldwide, globally, is that the wedge or the chip we need to get between governments for warfare? Like the United States will cut off access to SWIFT system, let's say, because we control that for Russia or countries that we don't like what they're doing, and thereby it's economic warfare. So is this the piece that goes around that, or is there a side piece that bolts on, latches on? And then if you want to touch on legal tender laws.
Yeah, I love the first question. Very, very relevant. So during the Ukraine-Russia war, we were trying to impose economic sanctions on Russia, right? To back up, we do own the SWIFT system. So the international bank-to-bank system is run by us, which means if we don't like your country, we just turn off the flow of money to your country. You could say that's a good thing. I personally do not believe our government or any government should have that power. I believe money should be neutral. But what happened is the US government seized financial assets from Russian oligarchs all over the world in a UK bank, for example, and many other places. And the net result of that is, well, the world just learned a very important lesson, which is that the US government is not neutral with their financial infrastructure. So any non-aligned country now has an incentive to figure out a way to route around SWIFT. And of course that's happened. And so we just lit a flare and we said, hey, go figure out a way around us. So we accelerated the transition away from SWIFT. And to answer your question, yes, Bitcoin is a way around the SWIFT system. No one's in charge, no one can stop you, anyone can use it. But I do think at a future state, yes, the US empire, our imperial power abroad will go down. That's a good thing for the average American. The warmongers, the neocons, not so good for, but for pretty much everyone else, that's a good thing. And in that world, we will have a neutral reserve asset, that's Bitcoin, and countries can settle their trade imbalances there or any type of commodity sale, whatever you want to do. If the US and China do trade together, do we settle in dollars or renminbi? Obviously, we want to use dollars. Every other country wants to use their own currency. Why don't we have a currency that is neutral and it's money for enemies? You don't have to trust the counterparty. The Bitcoin is the Bitcoin. And I think that's where we're going. I think that's the right way to think about global trade.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Brandon, for your time tonight.
We'll have you on a podcast. I have one more question.